This is the Final Word Cricket Podcast with me, Adam Collins, and you, Jeff Lemon, and soon with Mark Butcher, who is joining us, the illustrious commentator from Sky Cricket, Talk Sport, and all around the world where he's been calling Test cricket this winter in Sri Lanka and India and doing T20s in Pakistan and all the rest of it. So can't wait to bring that interview to you, Jeff. We've already got it in the can, it must be said, and he joined us for about I guess it was an hour and a quarter or thereabouts, going through his full life in cricket, as we love doing on these Final Word chats, and he was just a wonderful guest.
He's someone we've been wanting to talk to for a while. I think he's one of those players who's in my memory because of that Headingley day, you know, when you're younger and there are those innings that you watch for those moments that stand out. And there's something about the quality of the sunshine on that day, and it was the same sunshine on the Ben Stokes day in 2019. So there was in my own life a sort of harmony between those 2 days. But he's a much more interesting character than just the cricket side of things, and we found that out when we had the chat.
Yeah, about 12 months ago, during the first lockdown, maybe it was 11 months ago, we spoke to Nasser Hussain, who obviously plays in a similar era to Mark Butcher. Indeed, they overlap entirely when you consider Butcher's career starts in 97 for England and ends in 2004. He was playing under Nasser for the majority of that. But there's more commonality than that. I love the way they interpret broadcasting as a career in and of itself. They're not just former players who sort of pick up a bit of extra cash, you know, talking about cricket on the telly. I mean, these are serious broadcasters, and that's why they're held in such high esteem.
Well, I think it's also that it's something that takes that long to get really good at. You know, They're not characters who walked into it and were brilliant straight away, but they had the same sort of work ethic and applied it to that career as much as they had their first one, which cannot be said for everybody.
Hopefully that whets the appetite. There's plenty to that conversation. It'll be with you as soon as we can get through the other bits and pieces on our agenda. The first thing I should say, as I wave to the camera in my living room here in London, is that we are recording this entire episode for YouTube, the great unexpected success story of the Final Word in 2021 so far. I can't believe I'm saying this, but nearly 800,000 people have stopped by the Final Word's YouTube channel since we started adding videos to it. I think it was during the Melbourne Test match between India and Australia, just before, or just after Christmas rather. We did not see that coming, so we thought that why not expand upon our daily offerings and some other bits and pieces we've chucked up there with a chance to watch us do our thing week to week. So it's not us looking directly into the camera. In my case, it's I suppose I'm sitting on the sofa in a pair of slippers with my laptop stacked on 3 old copies of Wisden, 1989, 1990 and 1991, which actually, as it happens, would have been the year that Mark Butcher was signed at Surrey, 1989, just for some nice symmetry there. But no, and Jeff, in your case, you've got the log cabin set up that we're familiar with, having watched you on the daily shows there in the past.
Yeah, just about to pop into the sauna straight after we finish recording this one. Hello, if you're watching the video. Look, I'm not going to say it's very dynamic. Like, you're watching 2 people having a conversation, but if you're listening to the podcast, you're also just listening to 2 people having a conversation. So we look like what you might imagine 2 people talking might look like. If you want to watch that, that's fine. Or if you, I don't know, listen to your podcasts on YouTube Premium or whatever, then, you know, go for it. Fill your boots. I don't know who wants YouTube, but apparently people do. So it's fine. It's out there. It's for you. If you're about the tubes, we're in the tubes. The internet is a series of tubes.
And you can see Butch as well. It should be noted that we videoed, well, Zoom videoed Butch when we spoke to him. I wasn't surreptitious. We weren't in the sort of it wasn't a hidden camera type setup. He knew we were filming him at the time. So you can not only hear but watch.
Just up in the top right corner of the back of the taxi, when we were talking to Mark Butcher, we had the camera set up.
Yes, he was going to knock a bit off the fare when he was driving us to Cockfosters or something like that. So if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube page, you won't necessarily know that we're going to keep making those videos during the England-India T20 series, Jeff. That's a decision we made a couple of days ago. We won't be doing them straight after the games, but once I've woken up the following day, because of course they'll end quite late Melbourne time, middle of the night Melbourne time, we'll be able to review those games. So they won't go on the podcast feed, but they will be there on YouTube from my backyard and I guess, again, Jeff, from your log cabin.
Yeah, I'll be down in the cabin with the fever, and we'll find a way to make it work. The time zones are appalling for everybody at some point, but
Yes.
we'll just keep an eye on the channel. There will be more stuff going up there as we go.
All right, Jeff, let's crack on with our agenda before we come to our feature interview. A quick note about the Australian men, which I totally missed, I must admit, when New Zealand formally qualified for the World Test Championship final. So to recap, New Zealand were a lock the moment that Australia elected not to go to South Africa. It meant they couldn't be overtaken by both of England and India. Of course, India end up making it, as we know. But Australia would have made it on countback. They would have been level on points with New Zealand, just as New Zealand were level on runs with England in the 2019 Men's World Cup final. But because they were docked 4 points for slow over rates at the MCG Test match that we were talking about before, that was enough to get them beneath New Zealand, and sort of the rest is history. So, again, this was noticed at the time. It's not as though the ICC informed us this week. David Boone was the match referee, and so went the formal process. They were 2 overs late, and if you're 2 overs late, according to the World Test Championship provisions, you get docked 2 points, accounting for all the different allowances that they have, and there are many of those. But who would have thought that after all this time complaining about over rates, that it would actually come to something meaningful? We didn't expect it.
And something really substantial, This isn't a sort of slap on the wrist kind of thing. So it's 2 points per over, and then 2 overs, so 4 points out of how many? 500 and whatever it was. I mean, what are the
I think Australia. I think
that we're talking.
I haven't got it in front of me, but in the multiple hundreds, Australia might have ended up with sort of 360 odd of the 440 odd at their disposal, which I'm sure I've got that wrong. But the point here is that 4 points doesn't sound like an awfully big figure, but it dropped Australia to 69.5% possibly, and New Zealand were at an even 70. So had it been a tiebreaker, the fact that Australia beat New Zealand in the WTC cycle at home last Australian summer would have been enough to have seen them through. But instead, it'll be the Black Caps at the Ageas Bowl, and we'll talk more about that in a minute.
It wasn't quite head-to-head. I think it was done on a runs per wicket average.
Was it?
So
okay.
Australia had a better numerical WOTC. We probably should have looked this up before we did the show, but you get the vibe that I'm going for. And I don't want to sound unkind about it, but it is kind of funny in a way that such a small thing, because as you say, we've been banging on about over rates for so long, and nothing has happened. And every team takes the extra half hour as given and still doesn't finish their overs, even in the extra half hour. And you lose so much time out of test matches. And they've been hit for it. And as every AFL side knows, you don't want to drop the 4 points.
You do not. Well put. Pat Cummins at the time was asked about it and said he didn't know why they were losing the points necessarily, or because he was talking about the 12th men running out, drinks and the fluorescent singlets and so on. And that's definitely part of the problem, no question. But since Jason Holder missed a test match 2 years ago, and they got rid of that, so the captain no longer misses out in the event of repeat offences. But I suppose I thought anyway, the way I interpreted losing a couple of points here and there from the WTC, that was a tacit sort of green light to continue carrying on as players have in recent years. But it's an unexpected consequence here.
If you're out of contention, if you're not going to qualify and you know that a year into the 2 year cycle, then bowl as slow as you want. It doesn't matter. But it is interesting that up the top of the table with such fine margins, the barest of, if I dare say, it had an effect.
So that final, it's been confirmed by Sourav Ganguly, not the only piece of news the BCCI have confirmed on behalf of other organisations this week, it must be said. Sourav Ganguly, who's the boss of the BCCI, told a reporter yesterday that the final will be at the Rose Bowl between the 18th and the 22nd of June. We knew the second bit, but the Rose Bowl, it was reported they were going to use that instead of Lords because of the biosecurity environment, but that's all been inked in. So they won't be going to Lords as planned, but they will be going to a ground that did a fantastic job hosting a number of international fixtures last year during the worst of coronavirus. And I suppose it makes sense given it's unclear what the provisions will be for crowds. I mean, I know certainly in June there should be crowds, but I mean, are they willing to take that risk in the current climate? I can get why they want to take every precaution with players at a hotel.
Yeah, it would be just after that. Is it June 17, the date when things might ease a bit on the UK government
something
roadmap.
like that?
There and thereabouts. So it's probably a match where, I mean, India should be in it. The team that comes to Australia, loses the first game, comes back to win, and then loses the first test at home and comes back to beat England, deserves to be in the final, you would think. New Zealand, maybe slightly less so than Australia, but Australia had so many chances and blew it. But New Zealand did beat Australia in the T20 series, got that one 3-2 after losing the third and fourth matches, came back and won the fifth one. Martin Guptill got runs, and most importantly, the chair that Glenn Maxwell broke at the Cake Tin at Wellington is up to $2,000 on Trade Me on the New Zealand's eBay. If you want to get in there for a bid, it's still up till Thursday.
Yeah, it's raising money for a good cause as well. It's for a women's
shelter in Wellington.
Yeah. I mean, originally I sent an email to New Zealand Cricket and asked whether we could have it for the final word, but I think this is a far better outcome that the money is going to be raised and going to a cause that actually makes
I did have a couple of bids, so I got in there a bit earlier and did some bidding, but once it started to get into four figures, I thought, I'm not sure that I can justify that.
After my experience with the Batmobile last year, it can be a very slippery slope. So in a way, I'm glad you missed out and glad you pulled the pin prematurely. I quite liked how they exchanged shirts, Jimmy Neesham and Glenn Maxwell, given that it was Neesham who Maxwell did the damage off with the 28 run over, making his, 70 off 31 balls when he was about 10 from 10, and he looked like he was going to battle, but then he just exploded, and it was a joy to wake up to at the middle of last week.
Yeah, it was an over with 3 4s and 3 6s in it, I think. So Neesham signed the shirt and then added in the scoring shots below it, which is so a couple of final word favourites there having a decent time. The other results, well, there've been so many games and series going on. So New Zealand women went down 3-0 to England at home in their T20s. They lost 2 of the ODIs as well. So 1 game out of 6 for New Zealand women at home after winning 1 game out of 6 against Australia when they toured last September, and an ongoing concern, like just how bad they're getting. They look like their senior players look so jaded. Their junior players are kind of non-existent at the moment, and things like putting Hayley Jensen up to open the batting, who's a lower order slogger at best. No offence, but they just don't have the cattle at the moment. Yeah,
I agree. They're so far off the pace with Australia, England, and India, it must be said, who are now getting a chance to play for the first time in, a year exactly since International Women's Day last year when they played that T20 final. But it goes back, I think, 19 months since their last one-day international, and they've played a couple of those this week against South Africa, and they're going to play 3 more, then 4 T20s, 3 T20s, it must be said. Sorry, 3 T20s next week. But the point here is that India are playing again in a competitive series against South Africa. They've split the difference in the first 2 of those. So when you think about where New Zealand might fit in their home World Cup, which is being hosted, the final will be 12 months from now as well. So they're a long way off the pace when it comes to being able to genuinely challenge for that title, which seems such a crying shame given that 2 years ago when we were building up to that 2020 T20 competition in Australia, we were kind of thinking that if it's not going to be Australia, then it may very well be New Zealand, but that's inconceivable at the moment.
Yeah, well, they've got those 3 great senior players, but in Sophie Devine and Susie Bates and Amy Satterthwaite, but they've been carrying that team for so long that they seem worn out. The whip around the Shield, Victoria should have won but got rained off against Tasmania on the last day. WA and Queensland had a draw on an absolute road at the Gabba. What was it, 6 for 900 or something at one point, or 9 for 900?
I think 6 for 900 was the score at the Gabba during that Shield final back in 2007-8, I think it was. But yeah, there was. I think it was 9 for 600, the other side of the inverse of that. But yeah, Cameron Green in the first innings of that match, making a 250, 251 to be precise. I mean, made 100 in short form cricket last week, a double ton in grade cricket the week before that, and now 251 at the pointy end of the Shield season. Sure, he didn't make runs for Australia. He made a couple of half centuries, but he didn't go on to make a massive contribution in the baggy green against India. But you can just see, can't you? You can just feel it. A bloke who averages 60 in first class cricket at the age of 22, with the amount of tons he's now notched, he's not going anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely that. And Matthew Renshaw, the forgotten man of Australian cricket, Matthew Renshaw, 139 in the middle order. The poor old South Australians missed out on another win as well. 3 declarations in the match. They set a target. Alex Carey made 100. Chad Sayers, the Chad was great, made 52 not out down the order. Curtis Patterson, the forgotten man of Australian cricket, Curtis Patterson, made 102 for New South Wales the first time around. And then after the 3 declarations, they're set 295 to win. David Warner pings off 69. Nice. Sean Abbott made 83 and got out right at the end. Moses Enriquez 78 not out, and they ran it down with a leg in the air. So South Australia can't take a trick.
Yeah, so South Australia got reverse outrighted there in club cricket speak. Abbott was named player of the match despite not taking a wicket, which is a fraction unusual. 71, I think it was in the first innings, and 83 in the chase. Alex Carey, so an 80 last week in his first Shield game back after the white ball spurt, and then 125 here. I think that's his third first-class 100, second this season, something like that. But the fact that he was going to be on that tour of South Africa, and I reckon he would have played, that's a pretty good sign. Batsman. Yeah, that's my sense, that they were going to find a way to give him that test debut, and where he fits in post-Tim Payne, that's unclear, but he's certainly doing his chances no harm by making all these runs.
Yeah, I think exactly that. Although, a little word for Jimmy Pearson, who never gets talked about up at Queensland. Made very consistent runs for 5 seasons or so now. Another 50 in that game. It just doesn't get talked about as an option, but some players get talked about and some don't. A lot of announcements on International Women's Day from various organisations who were timing their run for exactly that. The Women's World Cups, both of them will be expanded as of sort of the second half of the 2020s decade. So the 50 over tournament will go up to 10 teams from 8. The T20 tournament will go up to 12 teams from 10, so more opportunities there for the Thailands of the world to get in and be part of those tournaments. And then there's this new tournament as well, the 6-team Champions Cup, which is basically just the ICC saying, can we have all the teams that might make some money for us come together and give us another tournament?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a fantastic announcement and one that we've been pushing for. The 50 over World Cup being an 8-team event is not in keeping with the way that women's cricket has grown in the last 5 years around the world. And the T20 being 12 teams, well, that's in keeping with the expansion of the men's comp. Of course, we'd love to see more. We'd love to see the men's 50 over World Cup increase beyond its current 10 teams too. But that doesn't seem likely. And I love the idea of this Champions Cup, which is, it just means they're going to get the chance to have a women's global tournament every year, which I don't mind. Hypercourse made the observation on Twitter that there was so many women's global comps. I think every year there was a trophy played for between 2009 and 2020, something like that. And his analysis is that must have played a role in elevating international women's cricket. So that 6-team tournament, it might be a bit light on. They might want to have a second 6 or something like that, also playing at the same time, or a promotion relegation, I think, is part of it. But nevertheless, the idea of more women's international tournament cricket is certainly a good thing. And as you say, it was part of a broader suite of announcements on International Women's Day.
I think it will work in the context of the women's game because that calendar's not so overloaded. They're trying to shoehorn some tournament like that into the men's game, but there's just not really room for it, and that's why there's been resistance from, particularly from the BCCI. But in the women's game, there's not so much, bilateral touring and that kind of thing, which means that this will be enough incentive for boards to get their teams to the tournament to play in that 6. But but the other announcement that came through was a test match to be played between India and England. Now, just a week ago on this show, we were furiously talking about how many test matches Mitali Raj has played in a 22-year career, 10 of them, and how it was a disgrace. That's what everything you don't like in sport is, a disgrace. It's a disgrace. And now, lo and behold, they must have a direct line to our show, straight to Surav, and they've whipped up a test match in what will presumably be a multi-format series like the Women's Ashes with, points for the one-dayers and the T20s. India and England, teams other than England and Australia, are going to play a test match between women's international cricketers. Who would have thought? It's possible, and it happened.
So much good news for women's cricket after a dreadful 12 months, all arriving on that day. A second announcement where the BCCI have put it out ahead of the host, I suppose. The ECB haven't said anything about this as yet. This was the honorary secretary of the BCCI putting up a tweet.
Oh, yeah.
Cracking massive numbers on Twitter for it. Well played him, I suppose. But yeah, multi-format series.
Got to get the clout.
Why not? Well, I mean, the multi-format series makes so much sense. If you're going to try and integrate women's Test cricket into the offering more generally, it makes sense for it to have context, and the best way to give it context is a multi-format series, and that's worked so well between Australia and England since 2013. I'm just thrilled to see that that's going to be expanded. So in the case of Mitali Raj and Jalan Goswami, they're 38 years of age now, the two of them. They haven't played an international since they were 36, and they'll get a chance to play another Test match, having both debuted, I mean, in Mitali's case, 20 years ago. So it's a nice story there, and looking forward to hopefully being in attendance at that Test match once we get a bit more information about it from the ECB.
Well, even that they're playing, this week in this current series, because they've both given up T20 cricket, but they're still playing ODIs. India hadn't played an ODI since November 2019. So they got back on the park this year after, 16 months or whatever that is out of cricket. Mitali made a 50, Julan picked up 4 for, and away they go, just continuing to be as good as they were. An announcement that came out of Australia on International Women's Day as well was that they're going to get a statue cast in bronze at one of the grounds of at least one former women's cricketer. They've currently got, you're the statue god, is it 70-something statues of blokes at the various cricket grounds? And
I think
not
they said there's 70,
woman.
73. If there's one topic I think I probably can declare expertise on it, it's cricket sculptures around Australian venues, given I spent 6 months researching this a number of years ago. But no, it makes perfect sense. I think the idea is at the SCG, where they made the announcement yesterday, they are going to have sort of a competitive process and work out who the player will be and so on. But yeah, I think the SCG sculptures are just so brilliantly done. They're intentionally at ground level rather than being on a plinth as they are at the MCG, so that you can kind of interact with them. I mean, we all know the Stan McCabe hook shot, which Steve Waugh and Rodney Cavalier collectively together worked out what the shape of that hook shot would be. So they got Steve Waugh to put on. Well, I think they went to the Bowral Bradman Museum and got out all the old clobber from Bradman, and Cavalier ended up being the model for it after Steve Waugh gave artistic creation to make sure it'd be authentic. But of course, Waugh's got one there too. Richie Beno passing the ball from hand to hand, which I think is my favourite of the lot. So, and a couple of others as well. But it'll be a great addition when they finish that. And yeah, something that's a glaring omission. And hopefully there'll be an opportunity to do this at the Casino Stadium at Perth, where the state government have announced some funding for this, I think, in the lead up to the last state election, and at the Gabba when they do this. Hopefully, when they do this redevelopment of the Gabba around what may very well be an Olympic Games building up to 2032, they'll find the space to recognise some players, men and women, at that grand old ground as well.
Well, if there's a statue at the Casino Stadium at Perth, it'll be of Gina Reinhardt, obviously. She's got that monument that's the big rock with her remarkable poem about special economic zones in the north of Australia. I wrote a breakdown of the poetic structure of that for some news outlets a few years ago. So, just one of the literary giants of our age, Gina, and whatever she turns her hand to, it turns to maybe not gold, but iron ore at least.
Yeah, it's not for this podcast, but one day I might speak to you at greater depth about the announcement of the Special Economic Zone in the Northern Territory and Northern Australia during the 2013 election campaign. One of those yarns, to say the least. Anyway.
The wash-up from the England and India Test matches. Everybody over there, Adam is in London, if you don't know. I'm in Melbourne. They are bloody furious about this rotation business, aren't they? They're just spitting chips. Had it worked, it would have been fine. The fact that England got beaten badly, the fact that England picked their teams very badly, all the rest of it, which didn't necessarily have that much to do with rotation, but they're spitting chips.
There's a lot here. It's one of those ones where it's hard to kind of capture all the perspectives without pissing somebody off. But look, put it this way. Chris Silverwood, the coach, has said it's staying. They're not scrapping it. This is staying, and it may very well be a factor inside an Ashes series. So, I think that the way we conceptualised it was that we would get to November, everyone would arrive for an Ashes series and then they play their best 11 for 5 tests. And look, maybe they will. But I think they're giving themselves this flexibility given just how much is on. So this summer it'll be a part of the conversation, as it will be, of course, when they play 2 test matches at home against New Zealand in May, because the Indian Premier League, the schedule that we received just this week, I should say June are when the tests are being played, but the IPL doesn't finish until the 30th of May, which means that it's entirely possible that English first-choice players will be in the latter stages of the IPL. We foreshadowed this on the show 2 or 3 weeks ago, but that's been confirmed by Chris Silverwood. They'll play the IPL. So it is kicking off. I mean, the usual types have been in the newspapers over the last couple of days, citing this is the reason why England is stuffed. And sure, no doubt that it contributed to their defeat, the scale maybe of their defeat, not having every single player at their disposal. But the idea that sort of Joe Root's not getting his way and Owen Morgan is getting his way kind of discounts the fact that Owen Morgan had to play with composite sides last year due to the bio bubble situation against Ireland, especially. I mean, they lost that third one-day international to Ireland, and that certainly wasn't the best England white ball team. And then I suppose there's these sort of subsets of the argument. You look at Sam Curran, who wasn't able to get back to India in time to play a role in the Test series, but now he will be available for the white ball cricket, will be available for the IPL. Johnny Bairstow went home after the Sri Lanka tests, returned on very little preparation, made 3 ducks in 4 innings. His Test career, at least in the short term, might be over. And Jonathan Liew wrote sympathetically and eloquently, naturally, given that it's Louis, about Bairstow in the Guardian newspaper today. I can strongly recommend that piece. Just kind of giving a sense of how tough it must have been for this guy, changing positions 14 times in 18 Test matches since 2018 when Butler returned and Bairstow went up the order for that home series, and everything kind of changed for him. So, yeah, and there's other HR matters at play as well. So Owen Morgan did an interview with The Times with Steve James. Great interview, but the main news point from that is that Alex Hales might be back into the fold this year as part of this broader rotation. So, I don't know, Jeff. I don't know how you see this, but the idea that it's simply prioritising white ball cricket against Test cricket, I'm not sure it's quite that. It's more that they're balancing the two off against each other, whereas before it was always Test cricket comes first. And that's never going to be easy when you've got so many 3-format players with the coronavirus provisions they need to have in place from country to country with travel and bubbles and rest and rehabilitation. And it was never going to be easy. And now that they've lost a series heavily, it's in sharp focus.
Yeah, and 2 things here. It's completely absurd for former players to be criticising current players for putting money ahead of their country when that's coming from players who took blood money to go on rebel tours to South Africa instead of playing for their own country back in the 80s. So, get back in your box. And the other part of it is that, the IPL was happening long before those 2 Test matches against New Zealand were scheduled. They were an afterthought. They were an extra squeezed into the schedule, partly as a helping hand to New Zealand, who were coming to play the World Test Championship final, to give them some prep, and partly as a way for the ECB to make some extra cash or to make up some of the shortfall of what they couldn't provide in the previous season, however that works out. So those Test matches were added in afterwards. A player not being available for those Test matches isn't the fault of the player who's already got a commitment to go and play elsewhere, even though the IPL schedule wasn't known ahead of time. But apparently the BCCI did make some concession in trying to make sure that it was over soon enough, or that has more to do with their own national team needing to play in the World Test Championship final. But they have factored in the English summer to some extent in terms of when the IPL will finish.
Yeah, it's far from a new debate. You're right in saying that. You go all the way back to the start with Kevin Peterson and Owen Morgan. I mean, Owen Morgan, of course, was willing to prioritise IPL over where he was positioned in the Test pecking order. I mean, it must be 7 or 8 or even 9 years ago now. So it's just that it's getting a rebirth. So a couple of years ago when England won the World Cup, a lot of energy was invested in describing the IPL as having been a major component part to that build. So they went from having, those 1 or 2 players getting a chance to, 8 or 10. And suddenly they're battle hardened partly by what they're able to do in India in this high profile, all singing, all dancing tournament once per year. And now that it's not as convenient with the test schedule, it's causing this kind of blow up. And you know what? I mean, I wrote about this for the paper the other day. It all comes back to scheduling. I mean, if we want to have... and this has been the case for years. Again, nothing new about this argument. But if we want to have a serious discussion about 3-format players, about how taxing it is both physically and emotionally for them, about how we recalibrate the schedule post-coronavirus and post-bubbles, hopefully post-bubbles, then we need to throw everything on the table. We need to kind of say, well, look, here are the T20 franchise competitions around the world. Here are the commitments that countries have to each other inside the World Test Championship, inside the Future Tour program, inside the bilateral One-Day World Cup that started last year, and be realistic about what's possible rather than always adopting the approach that more is more. Because when it comes to these players, it's palpably the case that more is not more. When you feed more in, at some point the machine breaks and we don't get to see the best players week in, week out, month in, month out, because they just can't do it. They can't sustain it, and we've learnt that. We've learnt these stories more acutely through this coronavirus year, and I hope that we can apply the lessons on the other side of it.
And the thing about making everything an either-or proposition, one of the things that we've talked about extensively over the last few weeks, watching India play in India and in Australia, was the preparedness and strength of their bench players who had been blooded through the IPL. Your likes of Washington Sundar and Mohammad Siraj, and even before that Jasprit Bumrah and so on, who came into international cricket ready to play, not intimidated by a big crowd at a foreign ground, because they've done that. They played in front of 50,000 people before at a hostile ground. They've done it for several seasons in a row in the IPL, and it's actually useful to have that experience. It's potentially more useful for an England player to play in an IPL final than it is to play in the first test against New Zealand, in terms of having a cricket experience that helps advance their ability to deal with the big moment.
Yeah, and this is another point I made in that piece the other day, that the IPL has been the catalyst for scouring the country. Harsha Bhogle talks about this all the time. Every corner of every village for talent. And the IPL franchises have done that. I think that should be a point of inspiration for English cricket, seeing what India have achieved. All that depth they have. The way they've been able to beat Australia in Australia with a third-string team, essentially, and then do the same after losing Jadeja, in walks Akshar Patel. I mean, the same applied in Australia. And if that's not inspiration to administrators in England, and look, remember that leading into the 2019 World Cup, their motivation was all about growing the game long-term. Finding the new audience was the cliche. Well, okay, that's great. We lost 2020, but straight back on that bike, find every possible kid they can and bring them into the game as early as we can. And then maybe that will mean there is greater depth in English cricket going forward. It follows that it should. We know based on what happens with smaller nations, that's the effect. And certainly in India in the last 10 years, put it this way, it's by choice, not chance, that they've got loads of fast bowlers now compared to what they had before. And they'll be the fast bowlers that are here trying to win the World Test Championship at the Rose Bowl against New Zealand. It won't be their spinners.
That's right. Before we get to Mark Butcher, Adam, would you like to play a little game?
I would. Let's do a quick round of it, I say.
A game that has a name, and the name is Nerd Pledge! Nerd Pledge. It's the game we play with the people on our Patreon page. They support the show and help it keep going, and they do that by sending us amounts of a currency of their choice, but not a normal amount, not a round amount. A different number, a distinct number, a number that has something to do with cricket. But they know what that number means, and we don't, and we have to work out what it is. 3 numbers at lightning speed. The first comes from Anthony Osborne. The number is $6.40, and Nerd Pledges don't have to send a clue, but they can if they want, and Anthony has. And Anthony's clue is, I doubt you'll need it. I doubt you'll need this clue, but my Nerd Pledge relates to the greatest test match I've ever seen in the flesh. Go forth, Adam.
Yeah, well, I know that Anthony's a Tasmanian, so that did narrow it down somewhat. Well, there was a fantastic test match played at Hobart in November 2011 where Doug Bracewell took 6 for 40 to rout Australia. He didn't rout Australia at all, actually. He consistently chipped away at Australia in 3 discreet spells and ended up taking 9 for 60 in that test match. But I went back through it. It was a hell of a match. I mean, Anthony's spot on in saying it's one of the greats. I forgot that the margin of victory. Yeah, well, the margin of victory was 7 runs, I think it was.
7 or 8,
and the first time New Zealand had beaten Australia in 20 years. The victory target was 241 after quite a bit happened in the first 3 days with Australia out cheaply, New Zealand out cheaply, then New Zealand out for 226 in the third innings. So there's Warner. Basically,
Second test match.
Yes, that's right. Second test match, having not made a contribution yet at test level. And if I recall correctly, Jeff, when he was picked in that first test at Brisbane, it wasn't as though it was hailed as sort of a positive thing. There was a lot of debate as to whether he'd have the game to last the test of time against the red ball. But he's picked anyway, on spec, I suppose you would say. And then he carries his bat for 123 here in this chase.
He was considered to be a slogger. He'd been in the T20 team. He'd played very little first class cricket. Was picked as a hunch. Made 4 and 12 not out at the Gabba. Should have had a wicket first ball. Got dropped at deep mid wicket. But that hadn't done much in his first test and didn't do much in the first innings. And then suddenly he was up. Yeah,
and it's a crazy finish as well. So at one stage, Bracewell's on a hat trick after nicking off Michael Clarke for a duck, taken nicely by big Roscoe Taylor in the cordon. But you press fast forward an hour or so, and Brad Haddin gets out, and then Peter Siddle gets out shortly thereafter, and Mitchell Starc gets out, and suddenly Australia are 199 for 9 and kind of out of the game. In walks Nathan Lyon. He's played about 4 test matches himself at this point, and he rides shotgun with Warner past 100. Warner keeps putting the foot down. Then Nathan Lyon hits a boundary, puts them to inside 10 runs of victory, and the ball goes back to Bracewell, and Bracewell goes through the gate. He castles Lyon, and they go absolutely wild, as I say, because it's the first time they'd beaten Australia in 2 decades. And looking back at it now, Jeff, it's in some respects a slightly sad story for Bracewell, as far as you think a 21-year-old who's capable of taking 9 for 60 against Australia and winning a test match, so his match figures, would go on to be prolific for a long time with that lovely shape he gets away from the right-hander and nip back off the seam. But he ends up taking 72 wickets in 27 test matches by the time he's 26 and doesn't play again. He's only 30 years old now. And look, we always remember him for having overstepped, but not really overstepped at the Basin against Australia in 2016, that Voges dismissal that should have been.
Yep.
But he only plays a couple of more tests after that, and he kind of goes into the domestic wilderness, and I suppose New Zealand would say they've moved on beyond him now. He played a little bit of white ball cricket in 2019 before the World Cup, but that was that. So his finest moment in the international game came as a 21-year-old, but it was an absolute pearler of a performance, 6 for 40, which must be the number for Anthony Osborne.
It must. He's got to go to India, Doug Bracewell. That's my my position on it. He's got to be in their squad. The next number is very similar to $6.40 because it's $6.20. It comes from Michael Fitzgerald. And there was also a clue with that said my nerd pledge would have been $0.62 rather than $6.20, but A, I didn't want to be stingy, and B, Patreon wouldn't let me be that stingy. Your other hint is that I think it's going to be a while before the next one. So 0.62. I thought, could it be 62? Aaron Finch made 62 on debut. It's going to be a while before his next test half century. Probably not going to come around again. Around about the time this pledge came in a couple of months ago, Bruce Oxenford retired after 62 test matches. So you could say it'll be a while before his next one, but it won't because he won't do that again either. And then I thought, well, it's probably not 62. It's got to be 0.62. It has to mean it's a ratio rather than a... Yeah. I was looking at ratios of maybe 6s per test match, too low, hundreds per test, but that would be a lot higher. And then I realised 60.62 would be 62%, wouldn't it? Who won 62% of the tests that he captained? Ricardo Ponting. Not the best ever, because Steve Waugh was nearly 72%. But Ricky Ponting did come second so far with 62% as his winning percentage. And I think it's right to say that it will probably be quite a long time before another test captain has a 62% winning tally. What would you say?
Okay, I like it. The second winningest percentage, as the Americans might say when they
Ian
talk
Healy
about
said that
their
actually
sport.
on commentary at one point.
Yeah. I'll accept it.
The most winningest captain, he said.
Yeah, well, as I say, that's kind of American jargon there. Remember when, speaking of nomenclature, when Ricky Ponting, for about 5 minutes, it was reported back to Australia, and I think it was the 2003 World Cup, that he was asking to then be called Rick Ponting because that's when he became captain. I mean, it turned out to be an incorrect story. It was a bung yarn. But I love the idea of, for at least 24 hours, everyone's thinking, hang on, Rick Ponting. It certainly has a different... I think of him differently to saying it like that. Rick Ponting, in the mind's eye, does not look like Ricky Ponting.
What about Whiskers Ponting? Would he have gone? Would he have gone with the name change in order to cash the check?
I've often thought about that. I mean, as a Geelong supporter, how did you interpret that when Gary Hocking said, "I'm going to change my name to Whiskers for a week"?
Yeah. Look, at that time, I think as a young, not even a young man, I was a child. I don't think that I thought that Gary Hocking could do any wrong. I thought whatever Gary wants to do, that's fine. I mean, he was called Buddha week to week. There aren't a lot of white men from Geelong named Buddha. And so if he wanted to go from Buddha to Whiskers and back to Buddha, like, that was fine. Gary Hocking could do what he liked.
I wonder how he handles
pick up 32 stats in the wet and snag one from the forward pocket. It was fine.
We had to fill out our census form this week here in the UK. And, there's that, have you ever been known by a different name question you'll get. I wonder whether Gary Hocking each 5 years has to go, actually, yes, for a brief window of time, I was known as Whiskers.
For 7 days, I was known as Whiskers. Was there a card issued, a sort of future talent type footy card with Gary Whiskers Hocking on it? I hope there was.
Third and final nerd pledge today, Jeff, was from Fran, and it's an easy one for me. It's 46.55, which, it must be said, is a remarkably generous pledge. I don't expect that Fran will be tipping in 46.55 every single month, but I'm so glad they are for the time being.
Fran's been doing it for a while.
Right.
And look,
we
don't expect, like, if you want to throw in $2, that's fine. If you want to throw in $46, that's also fine. But it's not expected. It's not necessary.
No. Well, we love you for it. We love you for it because it does make a massive difference. There's no clue, but it has to be the batting average of a man who made 3,631 test runs, 11 centuries, and made it above 50 a further 14 times in 89 test innings. Dean Mervyn Jones, the late Dino, his batting average at test level was 46.55. Jeff, I thought just to add a bit of extra to this, given that, that's pretty easy, isn't it? Dino's batting average next. Well, no, let's go through it.
But I like the commitment from Fran that if I'm going to do a batting average, I'm not going to go 4.65. I'm going to do the full 2 digits, because a batting average needs 2 digits after it. Not 1, 2. 2 digits. That's how we do batting average.
Full commitment to the bit. Well, Dino's average was into the 50s after the Madras innings, which of course was his third or fourth test match, so that makes sense. But it went down to 41 just before the 216 he made against the Windies to finish the summer of 88-89. Then it was back in the 50s again by the end of the 1989 Ashes, and up to 53, a high watermark, the following summer when they played Pakistan and he made his twin tons. Then it kind of hovered around the 40s between then and the end of his test career, what became the end of his test career in September 1992. But what I thought was pretty interesting was that in his final series, it went from 45.5 to 46.5. There wouldn't be many test cricketers who added an entire run to his average before he was dropped from the team. Of course, he made 276 in his final series, 3 test matches in Sri Lanka, including a century and a couple of 50s. So, just on that blunt measure of averages, it was a very strange time to drop him. I mean, we were very raw about it as Victorian kids growing up, and we never really let it go, as we explained in our tribute episode to Dean Jones when he passed away last September. But, just going back through it again, 46.55, an odd time for him to have lost his spot in the Australian team.
Yeah, exactly that. And you've obviously spent a lot of time on the cumulative averages section of Dino's career. I was having a look at that section of James Anderson's batting career, because he only recently dropped out of double figures. He'd spent almost all... In fact, James Anderson, after I think either 7 test matches or 7 test innings, had an average of 42. Because he'd accumulated a bunch of runs and only been out once.
Okay.
And he stayed in double figures for the best part of the, 40-odd years that he's been playing Test cricket. And then dropped down to about 9.4 recently, and then got back up to 9.55 with his unbeaten innings in the 4th Test match in India. So I think we need to keep an eye on Anderson's batting average, just as we're going to keep an eye on his wicket tally on the final word over the next few months.
Yeah, I thought that was a nice segue, Jeff. So we've in the past we've had little goals that we've set with the patron contributor number, which is remarkably up to 584, and that's just an amazing thing. We love you all for that. It's 2 years this month since we started sort of receiving pledges, and to think that we're still growing that platform the way we are is just a wonderful thing. So, but it means we've passed Lakshman, Lara. I think we had 281, 375 and 499 as our 3 goals. The third, of course, being Hanif Mohammed, highest first-class score, the second highest first-class score ever. So we're like, what's next? Well, there's a figure at the moment.
We've done all the batting numbers. We've kind of passed what you can make with the bat, basically.
Well, yeah, and right now Jimmy has taken 614 Test wickets, so he's ahead of us by 32. So I suppose I'm thinking if we can overtake Jimmy before he plays his next Test match, which will be presumably in June against New Zealand, that'd be a nice thing. If we could just nudge ahead of him, and then maybe after that we can have a bit of a stretch goal and try and overtake his first-class wickets tally, which is only 12 away from 1,000. But that's a fair way down the track, perhaps.
Or maybe we end up in a bit of a race with Jimmy. If he takes a bagful against New Zealand, he gets a couple of 10-wicket matches. Maybe he takes the lead again. We get back ahead. He comes back in August.
Yes, I like it.
Let's see. Let's race Jimmy on the final word. So if you want to be part of the fun, you can go to patreon.com/thefinalword. Make an account, and then you can send us, you set your amount, and that sends us a notification. We'll put your number on the list, and we will come to it on the show in the weeks and months to come. It's a lot of fun. We'd love to have you be part of it.
And if you haven't been listening to our Storytime apps, they've been going really well. They take a lot of work telling all these old stories, but even looking through some of the numbers for the week we've got ahead, there's some cracking tales there. So join us midweek, but also join us on Saturday and Sunday for Storytime. Jeff, let's take a break. Let's cool our jets. And when we return, it'll be us chatting to Mark Butcher. On the final word today, we have former England international, but these days international commentator with Sky Sports and Talk Sport. More recently in Sri Lanka and India on the freelance beat, doing television on India's away tours. Mark Butcher, thanks for coming and having a chat.
No problem. No problem. It's very nice to be here. Well, it's nice to be anywhere at the moment, I guess.
Yeah, it is. And I suppose we're doing the Zoom thing, which we should note off the top. Of course, we can't be in the same room as one another, but we'll do the best we can with those limitations. Of course, these limitations we've become all too familiar with. And mentioned you've been in Asia over the last few months. That was a big call, really, wasn't it? Leaving family and friends and going away to be not only in bubbles with the teams, I suppose, and the commentary teams in Sri Lanka and India, but also having to go through a number of quarantine bubbles and all the rest either side of it.
Yeah. Well, I had a little sort of taster of it I was in Pakistan before to finish off their PSL, which is obviously now that they've lost the second one, or what number 6 they're on at the moment.
Yeah.
That one's just been halted halfway through, and so I was in that position back in March in 2020 while I was out there doing the comp, and it got called off on about the 12th of March, I think, and then so eventually went back and did the finals, the playoffs, in October of last year. And so, yeah, I mean, look, I was relatively sanguine about the whole thing. I mean, there's no one on the planes. Nobody's traveling. You're almost safer zipping around the place to go and work than you are, getting on the tube to go into London. So there was no problem with that. I mean, the quarantine side of things was great for 5 or 6 days in Sri Lanka. I had a beautiful balcony and I was looking out over the beach and over the water. Writing a few songs and reading and generally not being bothered by people, which was tremendous. But after 5 days, I wouldn't recommend much more than that. You start to lose your mind a little bit. But there you go. That's where we are at the moment.
Yeah, I'm not volunteering myself for 15 nights in hotel quarantine in Perth again anytime soon. Hopefully the next time that I'm back over there, it's in slightly different circumstances. Watching you call over the last few weeks on television especially, it reminded me of something that Ian Smith said to us during the Calling the Shots documentary last year about the fact that he's an overnight sensation who's just happened to be doing this for 30 years. And there seems a little bit of that around you at the moment. It's not as though you're new to television broadcasting. You've been in the caper since you since you stopped playing domestic cricket back in 2009 and had a lot of experience before that. But it feels like it has been somewhat of a watershed moment for you calling these tests in Asia. Is that how it's been experienced by you as well, that you, in a way, you've almost taken a next step this winter?
Yeah, it sort of occurred to me that your exact words, really, the sort of the 15-year overnight sensation thing. But I'm very, very grateful to have had the flying hours behind me. Really, it's been great to do test matches. I've done as much T20 and domestic 50 over cricket and various other things, and it's all been fabulous experience. But hardly done any test match cricket, and of course that was the only thing I played, quite famously.
Yeah.
And so it's just really nice to be able to get the chance to, the way that test matches move, there are just so many more talking points. There are so many more nuances. There are so many more sort of periods where it's quiet, periods where it's up. You have to go through the full range of emotion with it, as opposed to T20 when you're kind of like shrieking like a banshee from start to finish. And so it was just really nice, lovely to get the opportunity to do it. I mean, it only came up because of COVID. On the one hand, it's been bloody miserable, but on the other hand, it's meant that I was in Sri Lanka when when they were looking for people to come and commentate from the England point of view. And if I hadn't been in Sri Lanka, I probably wouldn't have got the gig. There was massive difficulties in getting people. They would have preferred Nasser and Athers and the guys from Sky to come over and do their thing. But there was, the quarantine periods coming from the UK were 14 days and costs, and just everything about it was a nightmare. So the fact that I was in Gaul and notionally a 45-minute plane journey away, although I did have to go all the way back to Abu Dhabi to come back, but that's another story, meant that I got the gig. So great fun, and very grateful. Like, as I said, very grateful to have had an enormous amount, and it is an enormous amount of experience doing all various types of things, whether it be presenting, whether it be sort of roving reporter style stuff that Sky put me on for the IPLs back in the day, basic commentary, lead commentary, whatever it might be. I've kind of been there and had the chance to build all of that into my CV. So it just, I was able to just go in there and enjoy it, and it was a lot of fun.
Mark, we've known for a long while that commentators working for the BCCI have things they're not supposed to talk about and not allowed to, and so on. It seemed like a lot of the response to you, the positive response and enthusiasm for you, was that you were willing to say things that might not be entirely company sanctioned or all the rest of it. But it also seemed faintly ridiculous that was seen to be exceptional, because it's not like what you were saying was anything hugely critical or vicious or egregious. So it was very politely and good-humouredly stepping slightly out of line.
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, nobody spoke to me before, during, or after any of the test matches to say, okay, we'd prefer it if you didn't go here, or we'd prefer it if you were uncritical of everything that you're watching. That didn't happen. So, let's put that to bed straight away. And I understand that there can be various pressures brought to bear on the guys from the home team, but I didn't realise that was happening. I had no inkling that was the case. And as you say, if people were kind of noticing the fact that there might have been a little bit of disagreement or niggle in the commentary box, that's what the viewers at home love. And I think the only real philosophy, if there is one, from my point of view, when it comes to calling games and stuff, is that put yourself on the sofa at home. Imagine what would you like to be listening to? How would you want to be entertained by what you're seeing? And so I try to avoid coaching where I can, unless something extraordinary has happened. Because if you're talking to an audience that sat down to watch Test match for 7 or 8 days, they're gonna know more about it than perhaps is given credit to them for. And other than that, just tell them what's happening. Just call what's in front of you.
Yeah, and there's some similarities there, I suppose, to what Nasser Hussain said to us last year when having this conversation with him. That from his perspective, it's about keeping the viewer entertained and informed, and sort of leaving all the other baggage at the door, and treating this not like just something that he happened to step into after playing cricket and trading off his name as a former international, but becoming an authentic and true and legitimate broadcaster. And that's a similar journey that you've been on, which equips you to speak with authority when the time asks for it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it does the game. it does broadcasting a massive disservice to kind of not take it as its own job, as its own skill and its own set of rules and regulations and do's and don'ts. I'm very, very aware of the fact that as a former player, I would have been afforded more opportunities to have a microphone and to call live games than guys who have been working in radio and television all their lives, and so there's a responsibility there, I think, to take the broadcasting side of it very seriously, and as you say, not just fall back on the fact that you played once many moons ago, and that is enough. There are skills and things that are as far away removed from being a former player as there could possibly be, and you have to treat the job like that. And so hopefully I stay true to that. I mean, it can be difficult sometimes, especially when you're sat in a commentary box which is full of people who used to do your job. The temptation to kind of fall into a dressing room style kind of way of bantering can be difficult to resist. But again, hopefully, I mean, the other side to it is that the job is you're not there to cheerlead for one side or the other. That's the other side of it. You're as critical of England as you are Australia, as you are of India, as you are of anybody else. And as long as you can do that and you can call out shithousery from your side as much as you can from the other side, then you're halfway there. And then the rest of it is just trying to be yourself as much as you possibly can. And with me, that involves not seeing it as it's not life or death. It's a game, and hopefully it's fun. Although there were times during the last series where it wasn't a lot of fun for our boys, but that's it.
Is, in terms of hitting that quality mark, is that something that it has to be self-driven, or might be if you and a handful of other colleagues who do that? Because we, so much of the time, you've mentioned this before as well, there's no training really given to former player broadcasters. It's just, you've retired, you're famous, here's a microphone, off you shoot. And there's very little criticism given by directors on a lot of the programs. Did you have to decide that you wanted to be as good as you could possibly be?
Well, I'll put it this way, but Sky in the UK, as I said, I'm sort of really thankful to them for having given me an opportunity to do this going back as far as sort of 1999. Sitting in live studios and things like that. And the thing that you learn, or the thing that you were wise to kind of keep an eye out for, was the fact that you wouldn't get invited back if you weren't kind of showing that you had an interest in it beyond picking up the check. And so then it became, sort of having conversations with presenters, more senior people, the guys the guys working VT, the directors, trying to kind of get some sort of an idea of what television is like. Right. The fact that cricket is taken as read. That's why they've asked you. But TV in itself, and making television, and who does what, and who's what, the lighting guys, the floor managers, all of these types of things. Trying to have some sort of an interest in the production as a whole. And that I don't think I understood that until quite a bit later on. I kind of had managed to survive getting the odd gig here and there, but then you kind of realize, if I want to do this, if I want them to kind of to hire me on a more regular basis, I've kind of got to step my game up a little bit, and just being a former player just isn't enough. And so it is self-driven to a certain extent, and necessity driven as well. Mother of invention and all that kind of stuff. Not having a tremendous amount of skill outside of the game of cricket, and having decided that I wasn't going to, I didn't really fancy being in dressing rooms for the rest of my life, having spent nearly all of it in them up until that point. You've got to kind of get your head down and treat it as a skill that is there to be learned, and to try and be as good as you possibly can, as I try to do when I play.
Well, let's go back to dressing rooms and your earliest days in them, and we'll swing through your life in cricket and perhaps return to broadcasting a little bit later. Because, I mean, your life was in a dressing room there at the Oval. Your dad, of course, being a champion of the club through the 70s and 80s, and having played Test cricket himself, albeit once, but still nevertheless an international player, means something on the county scene. And I mean, you've described Surrey as having been in your blood from the outset, so there was kind of little surprise that you would go on to get a contract as a teenager and start playing the game that you loved. But give us a feel for what it was like being a little kid in the dressing room with all these heroes around you and your dad being one of them.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was just the best thing ever, being surrounded by cricket kit, brand new cricket kit, and Whitener and stuff like that, and having people like Jeff Howarth and Sylvester Clarke and people, you call them uncle. My old man didn't drive when he was playing for Surrey, so he'd all the guys used to come and have to pick him up, so they'd all pop into the house and say hi. So it never occurred to me that I would do anything else, which is kind of handy, I suppose. Sort of blissful ignorance of the fact that stuff could go wrong, because it just, I was in the Surrey dressing room from the age of about 3 years. Why wouldn't I be there for the next 30 or something? So it was a great time. It really, really was. Me and my brother used to, we still have people come up to me now who were Surrey fans, members or whatever back in the day when we were kids, you used to be allowed to go out on the outfield and ping a tennis ball around. And we'd be sort of like using members as target practice in the pavilion, but like pinging drives into the pavilion at lunchtime at the close of play. I mean, that's what we did. Still, like I said, those of them that are still around will go, "Oh, we remember you hit old Doris on the end with a cover drive or something." So yeah, I mean, it just fantastic. And so, all of that bled into the idea that this is what I wanted to do. I had, and as I said, I had no real plan B. In fact, no, I had no plan B. That was what it was going to be. And fortunately, I was blessed enough, as was my brother, with enough ability to make that a reality. And the difference between being sort of like the best at age under 12s, under 13s in your school and in your year and all that kind of stuff is a world away from what then happens when you sign a professional contract and stuff. Sort of standing out at under 19 level or whatever as a 16, 17-year-old and then you enter a completely different world when you're doing it for a job, and everybody else is trying to jump on your head as much as the opposition are. But yeah, like I said, it was a journey that was mapped out as far as I was concerned. It didn't seem to be any other course to follow.
Was there a kind of vertigo going up those levels? Because we hear a lot of people talk about this being, like you say, the best at your school or something, and you're monstering the competition in that grade. But then as soon as you go up to the next level, it's something else completely. Yeah,
I mean, I kind of had always been challenged or sort of thrown in younger, or I was playing sort of first 11 club cricket in the Surrey Championship, sort of age 15 or something, so I was always playing with people who were my elders and betters. But I think one of the differences, so I signed contract with Surrey at age 17, and I think we might have had sort of 28, 29, maybe 30 professionals on the staff back then. So when you come in as a snotty-nosed 17-year-old with a bit of a, cocky and a bit of a swagger, that sort of thing, nowadays it's completely different. These guys, 18-year-olds, are playing in the IPL in front of 40,000 people.
Right.
The way of things with seniority and all the other sort of old-time stuff that has pretty much left the county game now. And I can't speak for what happened in Australia and state cricket. But was that you had to wait your turn, no? So you were literally, you wouldn't bat in pre-season nets. You wouldn't do anything but sort of bowl, field, and run around after the senior pros. You probably wouldn't pick up a bat until you were sort of 2 or 3 weeks into the season starting. So it was just that's just the way it was. I didn't make my first class debut I played 2 full seasons of sort of second 11 cricket before I maybe played a couple of 40 over games, but didn't make my first class debut until the very back end of 1992. So it was a couple of years before I got anywhere near the sort of first team, and probably quite rightly so too. But the idea wasn't we signed these kids age 17 and we fast tracked them in. It was we signed them age 17 and we battered them, and maybe 1 or 2 of them sort of get through. One or 2 of them stick it out, but most of them don't.
So you got the patience.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you go on this trajectory of being, second team, first team. 5 years later, you're playing for England. You're in the Test team, which again, whether that was foretold or otherwise, you're there. I found it interesting reading through interviews you've done in the past. There's a couple of competing threads here. There's the Mark Butcher, the bravado that you had as a kid coming through, up against sort of an imposter syndrome that you first felt as an international cricketer in that first chapter. Is that how you've been able to look at it going back, that you had quite a lot going on above the shoulders in terms of balancing out this inherent cockiness that you had then against sort of a sense of, gee, maybe I'm not quite yet at this level as a Test opening batsman?
Yeah, I think you only realise that once you play it, though. That was the thing. It kind of that happened. I only had the realisation that, oh my God, this is really tough. Having been in it for a couple of, well, not quite a couple of years, but a few series.
Yep.
So, everything up until, if you take out the sort of the early years of being the sort of the junior pro at the Oval, myself and Adam Hollyoake signed at the same time, and we were the same character really. I mean, he's probably sort of slightly more flinty, slightly tougher than I was, but in terms of how our outlook and what we wanted to do, where we wanted to end, we both saw ourselves playing for England. There was no doubt that was the goal. So from there to actually making that debut. Now so made my debut against Australia in an Ashes series. Now I have to tell you this, I didn't really understand how much of a big deal the Ashes was for some reason. It wasn't a conversation. Maybe it was because England had lost them for so many years on the bounce, and it had been such a long time since, 81 and Beefy and the 86 and 87 tour, or whatever. But it kind of, strangely, it escaped me just how important that all of that was in the grand scheme of in the grand scheme of cricket, in the grand scheme of cricket, not just England as far as being an Englishman is concerned. And we'd been on an A tour 96, which Adam Hollyoake captained, and we all but the first game we lost to a New South Wales second 11, I think, in one of our first matches, and then won every game from there on in. And a lot of the guys, so myself, Ashley Giles, Michael Vaughan, Adam Hollyoake, Dean Headley, a lot of guys who were making their way would eventually end up playing for England, who were on that trip. Anthony McGrath. I mean, there's loads of people. And so again, it was kind of like, well, this is easy, isn't it? You'll rock up and play, you'll get picked, and that trajectory will just continue the way that it always had. But after the first test, Edgbaston, England win, and we're all on the front pages of the red tops and stuff. So again, this is easy. Yeah, this is brilliant. I didn't make any runs particularly, but it was kind of we just smashed them. Brilliant. And then I think I get not very many in the first innings at Lords, and McGrath took 7 for or whatever. And you wake up whatever it is the next morning, and you're out of the team pretty much. The scribes have had enough. They've sort of seen you and decided after 3 innings that you're not good enough, you're not going to make it, so you're done. So I think I get dropped on naught or something in the second innings. Mark Taylor of all people drops me at first slip, a relatively easy chance, but I swear to God, looking as I turned round, the ball righted itself. I think it was pull rifle bowling, about 3 meters away from him. The seam stood up and it just swung at him and it hit him on the wrist. I mean, Mark Taylor not laying a mitt on it. And I made 80 something, 87 and saved the game. And so, there you go. You've gone from being utterly useless 2 days beforehand to, bravery and all this kind of crap in the papers the next day. And there it was. There was the roller coaster had begun. And it didn't get any easier than that at all. Particularly in that period between making my debut in '97 and then being left out of the team at the end of the South Africa tour '99-2000. Yeah,
so these high points and low points as you're a young player in the Test team, Test 100 in one of the most, I suppose, fondly looked upon series in modern memory against South Africa in '98 to get yourself off the mark there at Leeds, and Ashes 100 at Brisbane, which admittedly it was a a drawn match in the end, but the very fact that you were able to start that series so well, you get those points, and you become the England captain, albeit briefly too, in that terrible summer of 1999 against New Zealand when Nasser's injured. But on the other side of it, I mean, you're battling, and again, you talked in the past about how this was a constant struggle for you, and things weren't going well for you off the field either. It was a volatile period of time. Do you think, with the sort of benefit of hindsight, that there was a degree of, we wouldn't necessarily call it then, but you were experiencing a sort of a depressive period in your life whilst being an England player? That volatility sort of was the through line in that period of 1999 especially.
Yeah, I'd made some pretty average decisions in my personal life, which resulted in my having two beautiful daughters within less than a year of each other. I'd wrecked a marriage in the course of doing that, and various other things. So there was all kinds of stuff going on off the field. But I think one of the defense mechanisms that I had built up was I kind of believed that I knew what I was doing. I had enough people sort of tell me at the Oval, oh, well, this kid really knows his game. He knows what he's up to, blah, 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 blah. And therefore, when things were going badly, I kind of didn't have anybody to turn to, because I was supposed to know. I didn't have sort of a mentor, if you like, who perhaps was a little bit removed from everything else that's going on. You have coaches and all that kind of stuff, all fine, who could kind of strip things back a little bit and kind of make me stop and have a little look around and adjust what I was doing physically on the field, definitely adjust what I was doing off it. That might well have made all of those things better. And the bizarre thing is that didn't really change. I mean, my international career was very much in two halves. It didn't really change in the second half, except for the fact that because I was out of the game, that I just asked my old man to help, and so we had 3 months. I had 3 months of having that mentor, and that 3 months got me 3 years reasonably successful in Test cricket, sort of from 2001 onwards. That 3 months, and again, after that happened, I don't think we never really kind of went back into things in that sort of detail, and I never really got my headspace as clear as it had been in that time. But it was enough. I was able to keep the wolves at bay and play well enough and enjoy it enough for it to kind of go all right from that point on.
You mentioned getting credited with bravery after getting dropped. It relates to something that I'm always interested in with cricket, which is the way that we, from a media perspective, apply a sort of moral projection onto what players do on the field. That I sort of have a theory that what happens in cricket is more about luck and good or bad fortune than you might want to admit. You can prepare as well as you can, but whether you get runs on a day or don't can be down to fortune as much as anything else. But then we project something onto it. Someone makes runs and we say, oh, how brave they were. Someone doesn't make runs and they were weak, or it was a weak shot, or a soft dismissal, and all the rest of it. I'd be interested in your perspective on that.
Well, I mean, I think cricket sort of reveals character, doesn't it? I think that's a given. It doesn't form your character; it reveals what your character is, and that's an important distinction. And because Test matches in particular are played over such a long period of time, if I were a football player and I'd had a terrible week at home, but I'd gone training, 2 or 3 hours a day up until Saturday, I reckon you could get through Saturday. You know what I mean? The bus journey, the game, 90 minutes on the way back, and then you go back to life after that. You can kind of park it for that period of time. But if the walls are crumbling around you and you've got 5 days stretching out in front of you, with potentially a 3-day gap and then another 5 days, it's kind of, that time where your brain is kind of, is being bombarded with various either stimuluses or the opposite of whatever the stimuluses are, beta blockers. It's very difficult to kind of to function over at a high level, an elite level, to use that awful word, over that period of time. That you need to have some quiet. The brain needs to be quiet enough to kind of to be able to do what it needs to do. And if you're not in that headspace, and your private life or your life outside of the game is a mess, it is. Some people can do it. I know some people who have been able to do it, but not very many.
Do you think that might have a bit to do with the fact that for a lot of cricketers that in order to get that quiet, they turn to other vices? Take booze, for example. Again, you've been pretty open about the fact that you drank pretty heavily through that stage of your career. I mean, in the absence of being able to get clarity, it's like, well, I'll get it another way. I'll get it sort of at the bottom of a bottle or whatever it is, to use the cliche.
Get quiet that way, at least. Get your bromides that way.
Yeah, but it's also, I think also, again, that era of cricket, you listen to the guys talking who played in the 70s and 80s. There is not a story that doesn't end or begin with beer or being in the bar or whatever else it was. I mean, that was it. I grew up with the old man and those teams or whatever. It was very social. You had the pub right next to the Oval, the Surrey Tavern. Me and my brother would be running around climbing over the brick walls while the team would be in there having a drink with the opposition after every day's play. It was just, it was very much, club cricket. Club cricket is entirely based around booze, isn't it? The bars being open means that the clubs function. You get a jug for this, a jug for that. It's all very much part of the culture. In terms of then using it as a way of, I found it very, very difficult to sleep. So you'd have a few drinks in order to try and make that easier. But that would obviously, as we all know, that's a very bad way to try and get proper sleep, because you don't. So then you think you need more, and it perpetuates. But again, talk about sort of reputational type things. I had the ability, in inverted commas, to kind of not have very much sleep, have a huge night out, and then turn up the next day like nothing had happened. And that became a sort of like a superpower. Another one of those weird things where you where an objectively bad thing became something that people looked up to you for. So, very, very bizarre. But that was the time. That was how things were.
Yeah. Well, just to go back to that relationship with your dad, did you get much of a chance when you were a kid to watch him play? Did you have that, moments that stand out of seeing him sort of being able to be the hero on the field? Because it's like seeing someone on stage when they're on the field, they become somehow more than human in some sort of way. But to be watching that, being your own father, I imagine would be, could be a very powerful experience.
It could be. But they were. But again, they were so. These guys were so familiar to me that that wasn't really the case. I remember meeting Larry Gomes and Viv when there was it was either a tour game or a sort of charity game where the West Indies team were over in maybe '84. I remember that was the first time I thought, whoa, these guys are something else. And so no, I mean I didn't. I mean, and when I'd spend all that time at the Oval, but again there used to be a hard net or whatever at the Vauxhall end, and we were allowed to go and use them because Dad was Dad. And so I'd very rarely see any cricket. I'd be playing myself. But I do remember getting nervous watching him on the TV once or twice, sort of hoping and praying that he'd make some runs. But beyond that, no, it was not that. It wasn't that type of thing. I know that I was very proud that he played, and I know that I was very proud that people had a lot of respect for him as an opening batsman and a player of fast bowling. So yeah.
And I suppose that time in the wilderness that you had after getting omitted from the side in 99-2000, and then when you returned to it, you've talked about that sort of intense period working with your dad, who of course is an exceptional sort of highly regarded coach as well. It's not just a father-son thing, but from a technical perspective, able to get you back on track from being a second team player remarkably at the start of 2001 to being a hero at Headingley later in that year. And again, you've talked in the past about how you found a way through, in the in-between time to evaluate what cricket really was to you and lose a little bit of baggage, which meant that by the time you were recalled and got that second sustained opportunity, that you had that broader perspective. And maybe I wonder the extent to which that might have been achieved from your father, given you'd seen so much of him, but plays one test match, and thus he sort of scaled that height. But it didn't make him any less a person or cricketer or father because he hadn't played 100 test matches. You know, there's a way of threading it together there, right?
I think so. But also, I mean, I had never spent that sort of time with him before.
Right.
Never. I mean, you know, when I was a kid and me and my brother Gary were kids, we would see Dad in the winters when he was coaching us football and PE at the school that he taught at in the off seasons. And so we would see him, and that he'd be a teacher then. And then in the summers he'd be off playing. So so the only time I'd ever spent that sort of time with him, particularly around something that you would imagine that he'd have been in the garden throwing balls at me the whole time, it just wasn't the case.
Right.
So that the January to April time that we spent in 2001 was utterly unique in our relationship. And it worked because I was at such a low ebb that I said to him, you know, do what you like. Treat me like I've never played the game before, because I'm thinking about quitting, because I'm hating it. And so, but I want to give it one last shot.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not, I won't fight you. Just, you know, do what you like. You treat me like I'm a piece of putty and do what you want. And he did. It was literally, we went back to him teaching me how to pick the bat up properly, to grip the bat properly. He said he thought my grip had got too strong, hands too far around the back of the handle. You know, I wasn't free enough in the way that I wasn't free enough in the way that I could swing my arms. So he taught me how to pick the bat up. I played 27 test matches. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So where are we? 2001. So I'm how old? 29. Taught me how to stand, how to pick the bat up, how to grip it properly. All of these things. It went back as far as that. And I let him do it. You know, I can imagine in different circumstances, there's no way on earth that would have happened. And he said that to me since. He said that he'd wanted to make the call, or he wanted to come and spend the time, but he just didn't see how I would take it. And I wouldn't have taken it well if he'd have sort of said to me in the middle whilst I was still playing for him, you know, I actually don't think you're doing this very well. You know, fathers and sons and that type of conversation, they're not renowned for that working out. But it worked out this time because I had no sort of fight or ego in me left to stop him. So, and that's why it worked.
And did you have an awareness at the time that spending time with him like that was something special, and you know, something that hadn't happened before and wouldn't be replicated?
I looked forward to it immensely. You know, I think I can't remember exactly, but it felt like we'd spent every day of every week for 2.5 months together. It wasn't like that. It wasn't as much time as that, but that's kind of what it felt like. And I just, you know, it was like really being desperate to get to work every day. And we had a really good time. And, you know, I don't know, I'd have to talk to him about it. But there was something in the relationship that had not been there before because of it. And, you know, and at the end, I remember vividly being told sort of after, so, you know, this is obviously the lead up to 2001 and the heading the innings, was that he'd been in tears the TMS had managed to get him on the phone at the end of the game, and he was and he was crying on the radio, you know. So it was really special, and it never really happened again. I mean, we had a pretty frosty old time of it as captain and coach at the Oval back in 2000, where conversations went back to being father and son, you know, stubborn and cranky. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I'll look back forever on that as being an incredible time with him.
We often like talking to people on this show about their perfect day, the one day when everything clicks and when the game was never better for them, well, chasing 315 on the final day at Leeds, the ground where you made your first Test ton, but 3 years on from that, an unbeaten 173 faultless, flawless innings, where you were at your most fluent and all the rest of it. I mean, I don't suppose you would have had a chance to have thought about your dad too much when you were in the middle, but after that, obviously hearing his response on radio, but getting the chance to, I suppose, realise this had been building from the work you've been doing with him, and you're able to experience that not just for you but for him as well.
Yeah, I mean, the one regret I have about that day is that I didn't mention it. The whole thing was just so bizarre. So post-match interviews, etc., etc. Now, if you look at the way that the guys are when they do man of the match appearances, or the captains are talking about matches that they've won or lost and whatever, and how magnanimous everybody is, and how much less self-absorbed people are when they're talking. Generally, not everyone, but generally. And that's the one regret I have about that day, was that I didn't mention him by name or mention what we had done leading up to that in the post-match stuff. But I didn't really understand what had happened, to be fair. I mean, I knew that I'd been playing well in the series up until that point, and felt like I owed it to myself, and owed it to the team to kind of make a bit more of, because it was a struggle. We were getting battered as always. To make more of the form that I was in, and so, but to play like that against that bowling attack was the sort of stuff that dreams are made of. And so it didn't occur to me that it had happened directly, and there is no equivocation about it, directly because of what we'd done in those months. All of the things that we'd spoken about, all of the gifts that he'd sort of given me in terms of freedom of the bat swing, freedom of being able to access all different parts of the park, being more solid in defence, footwork, all of those things were a direct result of what we'd done. So I bought him a very expensive watch at the end of that summer to say which I think he's lost. Terrible with watches, my old man. But anyway, it's just it's one of those things. It was again, I don't know how many people get the chance to. And the innings itself and the day, been there and spoken about it so often, it's kind of, it bores me now. But the chance to have done something, and spent that time with a family member, somebody that you've been that close to, and have it pay dividends to that degree. I know people have sort of coaching relationships, tennis players and whatever, or you have caddies and the family members and all those types of things. But this was a little bit like I'm guessing this is where the tears came from. It was a little bit like teaching your little boy to kind of to ride a bike, and watching them watching them ride off into the distance. It was that type of thing. So yeah, I'm forever grateful for that.
And there's something symbolic there with the watch being gone, about the time that you share together and that you don't get back once it's gone.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I don't think nothing has ever. We've never ever been that sort of tied in or close or whatever since then. It was that period, and it was incredible. And now we just take the mickey out of each other on WhatsApp every day, like most people do.
And I suppose thus begins this second stanza of your international career from the 2001 Ashes onwards. But it's kind of hard to get into that without the diversion at the end of the 01-02 tour, when you're in New Zealand and you receive the utterly tragic news that Ben Holyoake passes away, of course, teammate at Surrey, and a family, you've grown up with the Holyoakes, as you said. And that obviously is significant no matter how we frame this up, but the very fact that you picked up the guitar for the first time since you were a teenager, the guitar which you kind of put away, as you've explained subsequently, when you were signed by Surrey. Out it comes again to write a song of tribute to your friend, and obviously there's a lot here, but that must be a time in your life, not just your cricketing life, that you think back on with such strong memories. Yeah,
I mean the trip itself. I mean, imagine trying to play cricket after something like that happens.
Yeah.
And that happened. I remember getting out in Wellington, the test match was, and walking back into the dressing room and finding that the dressing room was empty. Sat there taking my pads off, and the TV's on in the corner of the room. No sound on, and a ticker tape runs across the bottom of the screen to say that Ben Hollyoak's been killed in a car accident in Perth. And I'm sort of sitting there reading this, and there's no one else about, and I'm kind of thinking, where the hell is everyone? Do they know about this? So I kind of chucked my gear off and went and found, that everyone was sat in the viewing room at Wellington. There's a little viewing room out looking out on the game, and I burst into the room, and I can't remember whether it was Phil Neal, our team manager, kind of realised that something was up, and sort of he grabbed me and took me out of the room before I had the chance to say anything. And I said, "You know what's happened?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, what we do? What's going on? Do the boys know?" He said, "Well, nobody knows yet. We're in the middle of whatever the session was." And that, so come, I think maybe lunchtime or whatever it was, again, my timeline is a bit off on this. I don't really remember, but everybody was then told. And I just remember myself and Graham Thorpe out on the, found a stairwell and kind of got through half a packet of cigarettes and kind of just sat there bawling our eyes out. And then we come back the next, terrible night. Everyone goes out and has a drink and whatever. And turn up the next day, and they do, we all do a sort of a guard of honor stood out on the park before the day starts, with cameras kind of like right in your faces, panning up and down, and we're just beside ourselves. And we had to play the game. And the rest of the series, I barely remember what happened. Shocker.
I imagine at that point you could not give less of a shit about a cricket match.
Exactly that, yeah. Exactly that. And it was, you kind of, you're there to do a job, and the people are buying tickets to come watch you play and all that kind of stuff. I think we drew the series 1-1. We probably should have won the game in Wellington, funnily enough. But didn't have the will really to kind of push it over the line, and then got ambushed on one of those drop-in things at Auckland, I think, in the last one, and drew it 1-1.
I'm interested,
and that was that.
Yeah, I'm interested in that relationship between that tragedy, that terrible tragedy, and that emotional release you got from picking up the guitar and investing in your music and writing a song for his memorial service when you got back to the UK, and how that all sort of ties together. Because of course your music's such a big part of your life, and we haven't even really touched on it yet.
Yeah, it's well, I mean, I always took an acoustic guitar with me on tour.
Right.
Stop the fingers going soft. And so I think we got taken up one of the famous hills there in Wellington, and I played Marley's Redemption song, I think, as we all sort of sat around and tried to make some sense of it. Just bizarre type of thing. But the song that I played at the memorial in Southwark, I wrote when I got back home.
Right.
There was a bit more brain space to do that back then, and the wonderful thing about that was that I ended up in a recording studio. We made a recording of it and sold it to raise money for the Ben Hollyoak Fund, and then John and Daria, Adam and Ben's mum and dad, asked me if I'd play it for them at the big memorial service in Southwark Cathedral, which was one of the more terrifying things you will ever do. But yeah, so I mean that was that, and it, again, good stuff comes out of something terrible. In that I started to sort of write, and that side of my that side of my life sort of took off again, with playing live and recording and various other things, and I mean, that would end up leading to my first album, which was sort of 6-7 years later. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's ridiculous really. I wouldn't say that it was directly responsible, but certainly in terms of being able to meet up with various people from the music business, recording artists and producers and things like that, it sort of opened up one or two doors that perhaps wouldn't have done otherwise, which is pretty horrendous, really, when you think about it. That it was something like that. I mean, that's the way that life goes, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have these tragedies or these tremendous sort of high points, and that life then changes almost as a direct response to them, doesn't it? Either in terms of opportunity or in terms of something not good happening. That's just the way that it is, and you're always sort of hostage to fortune in that way. I think that's one of the most interesting things about everything, isn't it? About life, is that you're never really sure, you never really know. You can have a plan and you can decide that this is what I want to do, or this is how I want to spend my life. This is the way that I'm going to make my living, etc. But sometimes circumstances pop in, and events get in the way, either for better or for worse.
Yeah, there's the chain of cause and effect that you can predict, and that you can anticipate and put into place. But then there are the causes and the effects that you can never anticipate.
Indeed, and they seem to make regular appearances in, or at least they did through my 20s and 30s anyway.
So, and then I guess something that I reckon I've noticed as I've got older is that those big moments, whether they're the great moments of grief or of triumph, they seem so long ago, but they're also so present. They can be the years in between time can just disappear, and you can be emotionally almost in exactly the same place when it comes back to you strongly.
You can. I mean, one of the things that I think that I've learned really is that, generally speaking, that if you're open and available, but also if you realize or recognize that there's work to be done, or that there are it's not simply a case of just kind of things landing in your lap, then you've got a pretty good chance of making them happen. Like I said, you're always sort of going back to what I was saying in the beginning, that if sort of reputationally I hadn't had people come chase after me to do the Sri Lanka trip on that one, then I wouldn't have been in the right place to have got the India trip.
Yeah.
Now, that's fortune for sure, but it's also, you have to give yourself, every once in a while, it's nice to give yourself a bit of a pat on the back and say, well, perhaps you deserve that this time. Whereas I think in the early days, things would just happen, and I wouldn't really have had a great deal of say, or wouldn't have sort of put processes in place to make them happen. They were kind of either happy coincidences or just right place, right time. But I think you can have a little bit more. You can have a little bit more of a say in the unknown things if you're putting the work in and you're trying your very best to do the best you can. It gives you more of a chance, I think.
When you go through this stretch of playing consistent Test cricket for England thereafter, so between middle of 2001 and the end of 2004, where you play every Test, you never dropped, you never injured 42 on the bounce, which is quite an effort when you consider the way that English cricket was. Well, I suppose not so much in the early 2000s, but the reputation from the 90s, which of course you later documented in that series you made for Sky Cricket. But I'm interested in the way that you prepared yourself through that stretch. So you're more emotionally available perhaps than you had been before. You've been through quite a bit in your personal life, but as you've explained it in other interviews, you still managed to put up that wall around yourself, almost that protective shield, so that you could have that sole focus of making runs and being productive for England.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, I think there's a certain amount of bluff involved in all of it, because I made a promise to myself when I got selected. Again, when I was selected for that Ashes series in 2001, it was because 5 other blokes had fallen down injured before the series started. So I was under no illusions of the fact that I was anywhere near first choice in the team. And because of that, I thought, well, this might not last for very long. It might be, I might play this series. Yeah, the heading the innings was great, etc., but it could be that they go back to whatever their first choice might have been. If I have a couple of failures, then
right,
that'll be that. And I was kind of happy. I was not happy with that, but I was kind of resigned to that fact, and I wasn't going to beat myself up about it. because where I'd been, and where I'd been and where I thought I might end up had been exceeded by being picked for England anyway. See what I mean? So I basically just thought, I'm going to enjoy this as much as I possibly can. I'm not going to get sort of bogged down in the sort of being worrying about whether I'm going to get selected or not. I'm not going to worry about anything. I'm going to go out there and give everything, as much of a crack as I possibly can. And that meant everything. On field, off field, the whole lot. And I did. And that's what I did. It caught up with me in the end, sort of around about 2004. We won in the West Indies in 2004. And I contributed. I averaged 50 in the series and got battered by Tino and Fidel on some pretty interesting decks, but made runs. Hadn't played particularly well, but made runs and contributed to us winning for the first time in 50 years or something. So something to be proud of. But I wasn't in great nick, and I wasn't in great shape by then. I was kind of the toll was starting to be taken of just how much fun I was having. So I picked up a bunch of injuries in the summer of 2004. Had a rough old time of it against New Zealand. I've never seen it be able to score any runs against New Zealand. I don't know what that was all about, but it was just always a shit team for me. Couldn't get myself going at all. And again, there was another interaction I remember with the old man. I was in a hotel room at Trent Bridge, and I called him up. I thought, well, I'll call him again. And I said, look, I'm struggling here. I don't think I can do this anymore. And he put the phone down on me. He just went donk. Oh, okay. And okay, right. I'll stop feeling sorry for myself. And me and Thorpe put 150 or something in a run chase in the last innings of that Test match, and we won the game. I got 60 odd. But anyway, even then, I was just struggling. I wasn't right. And so I hadn't really learned a massive amount. I hadn't learned a huge amount from the first time. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Right.
But what I was able to do was I had a technical proficiency that married up with the ability that I had was able to make me successful. Mm-hmm. Now I'm not, like I said to you before, I'm not big on numbers, but I had looked back because I was trying to work out. You sort of sit there and you're commentating with Sonny Gavaskar and Peterson and goodness, these guys who have got incredible records in the game. And I'm sort of thinking to myself, well, how much credibility do I have standing up to these guys, or getting involved in arguments about various stuff? And so I just thought, I need to kind of look into this, because I knew that one part of my career was better than the other. So I looked into it, and I averaged 50 at home between 2001 and 2004, right? 50 something, and 41 overall in that period. So I had 25 or something in the first bit of my career prior to 2001, and 41 batting at 3 for the next bit. And I sort of pushed my chest out a little bit. I thought, oh, well, that's all right. I hadn't realised it was that good. There'll be Australians watching this going, oh, fucking hell, 41, Jesus, these poms.
41.
But anyway, yeah. You know what I mean? But I hadn't realised that I'd kind of, that I'd been as consistent as that.
Yep.
And so, to be honest with you, given the way that I was living my life and the way that everything else was going on, what the old man did and the things that we changed back in 2001 lasted a very long time. I mean, had I been a smarter guy, I think I'm reasonably smart now, but had I been a smarter guy when I was playing, it would have paid much bigger dividends than that. But like I was kind of playing on it, every game felt like it, or every series felt like, well, this might be the last time. How much longer can I get away with this? And so that's what I did. And so again, sort of regrets or whatever. I think I should have been a better player than I was, or I should have been more productive than I was. But my life and the way that I was living it, and just kind of got in the way. I was never as focused on it as I ought to have been. and I freely admit that now. If you'd have said that to me back then, I'd have told you to go and do one. But I look back on it now, and I think, especially when I spent a lot of time broadcasting now around the current players and about the way that they go about things and the way that they live their lives. I mean, it's completely different to how things were back then. And they kind of, they work unbelievably hard, and they are very focused, and they are, they might not always be great, but who is? But it's very different now than it was then.
It's interesting that you can still have imposter syndrome after playing 71 Test matches. Be like, I wasn't that good. I could have been much better.
Well, I mean, no. Listen, I was as good as I could have been, given everything else. But it didn't. See, it never felt. And this is a massive failing on my part. It never felt as though it was that it was that serious. I never really treated it with the respect perhaps that it deserved. And who knows, if I had done, I might have driven myself nuts and been worse. Yeah. But
might have been worse.
I might have been, but who knows?
The way it finishes up, there's like most sporting careers don't get a big farewell and a parade and all the rest of it. And there's sort of a metaphor for death, I suppose, in that it
every time you get out,
you.
there is. Every time you're dismissed, it's like a little death, isn't it? Although the French call a little death something else.
Yes,
look it up.
Not in quite a satisfying way. The different les petits morts can be quite distinct, but that when a sporting career stops for one person, it keeps going for everybody else, and that's kind of that's how it was for you. You had an injury, you had a bungled operation, and then it was just this sort of mid-series overseas in South Africa. All right, you're off home. See you later. No fanfare, and that's it.
Yeah, pretty much. I always remember Simon Jones coming down to see me off at the hotel. I'll never forget that. Jones is a great man. I mean, we obviously had a similar thing happen with him at Brisbane, where we thought we might never see him again. And I think he remembered that, and he came and saw me off at the not at the airport, but at the hotel. And that was it. I was done. And maybe I wonder if maybe in my mind I knew that. There was an Ashes series coming up, 2005. I didn't, I had to have the operation didn't happen in the end until sort of the middle of February, February the 13th, which was the day before Valentine's Day. And I didn't recover from it until late August, and even then I had to have it done again. So maybe I knew when I left South Africa. I don't know. Maybe I kind of had an inkling that this was gonna take more than I had in me at the time to kind of to come back from. I mean, it's so then you watch that series 2005, most of it as a fan. Wasn't playing myself. It was my benefit year actually at the Oval, so I was kind of doing events and trying to make a few quid for retirement,
Yeah.
And I remember just watching the cricket, just being spellbound as everybody else was by this incredible series, and then the sort of the realization, the Trafalgar Square day was kind of like, oh my God, Christ, I that should have been me. I should have been there,
Well, you foreshadowed it. You foreshadowed it in 2003. I'll read a quote to you from 2003 when you're kind of, in the middle of the team. We've sat down together and thought, imagine how big the bunch of players who win the Ashes will be. The country's so hungry for it. You wouldn't have to do anything for the rest of your life. It'll be just like the boys of 1966.
Is that what I said?
You said that. You essentially foreshadowed what it would be like in 2005 for that group of players. The 1966 comparison is right there in the Trafalgar Square, open top bus and the way that team's deified. I mean, really, even to this day, isn't it? If you're a member of the 05 squad, even a bit player, and you sort of, this mirrors a part of the chat we had with Nas, I suppose, in a way, that you and he were part of the teams that laid the foundation for that success in 2005, yet you weren't able to be there. Now, Nas was fairly phlegmatic about the whole thing, saying that his career ended when it did, and that was cool. But you being a fraction younger and you having been there just before, I mean, it must be tough knowing that you were kind of within touching distance of being part of that team, having been part of another type of team that's remembered in a slightly different way.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, and I can remember the exact moment that dawned on me as well. I was in a dressing room at Edgbaston, playing or trying to play in a 4-day game up there when that whole thing was happening. And I remember watching it on the TV, and I had to get myself out of the room because I started to well up, because that was the moment that I realised, crap, missed out on that. That's interesting that I'd said that before.
Yeah.
I'm not as daft as I look, am I? But there we go. But during the series itself, it was kind of like, it was just so gripping. It never really occurred to me to think about it from that point of view. But when it was over, yeah. But who knows? If I'd played, we probably would have lost.
Well, it would have gone differently. You might have won more convincingly, and then it wouldn't have been as exciting and wouldn't have been as memorable. So,
well, exactly.
There had to be a close result.
That's your story, and I'm sticking to it. Yeah.
There we go. Maybe someone like Simon Jones, who did play in that series but never played again. He's probably someone who got burned by cricket as well. He's not someone who's getting paid big money to lead the commentary on different channels and all the rest of it. He's kind of been is outside, nowhere near the limelight and all the rest of it.
Yeah, that's true.
Maybe being there doesn't necessarily change that.
No, maybe not. I mean, I think the one thing that you can almost taste and remember are the victories. I don't know. I wonder. I'd be interested to know if that's the same for the Australian teams that I played against, because Christ, they won so often. It must have been boring. But I can remember. I can sort of smell the celebrations in the West Indies after winning down there. I could those things jump out at you and stay with you for a long time. And if there's one thing that I miss about playing, really, it's kind of that. I don't really miss much else, but I do miss the wins and those shared times that you have when the euphoria is just out of this world. So for 2005, well, if the guys can remember any of it, sure, it was bloody good.
You said something at the start of the chat about sort of not missing dressing rooms as such, which I suppose informs why you went to the broadcast side as opposed to the coaching side, which is often a decision that players need to make when their playing careers finished, as yours did in 2009. But I loved something you said on Twitter last week about your passion is for the game, and not having a dog in the fight helps you with that. Not feeling, I mean, you're a former England player and no one's questioning your patriotism, but when you're working in cricket, your focus is on the game at large, capital G, sort of as opposed to whether, England have a good session or not. Your emotional tie-up now with cricket is about the love of the 22 yards in the middle. And I think that's sort of
cricket.
Yeah, well, yeah, but there's a nice way of sort of evaluating that, isn't it? That all that you went through as a player and all that you've seen as a broadcaster, you've still got that passion that you probably had as a little boy in that Surrey dressing room. Yeah,
exactly that. And I think what I'm doing now allows me to feel that way about it. One of the things I felt at the end of my playing career was that I was so emotionally involved and caught up in who was winning and who was losing. I was captain of Surrey. We were having a pretty shocking time towards the back end of the first decade of the 2000s. And you just carry that with you. That would hurt in ways that I didn't want to experience anymore. And I was starting to hate the sport because of it, because it just wasn't, I didn't enjoy feeling as sort of culpable or as emotionally tied up in those wins and losses. It was my identity, I suppose. So Surrey County Cricket Club, and so I perhaps felt it more keenly than I might have done if I was doing another job somewhere else. And so part of the way of, the only way really of being able to stay as in touch and as in love with the game was by removing myself from the nuts and bolts of who's doing what, who's scoring runs, who's winning, who's losing, and being able to see it as a whole, and to enjoy it for what it is, to be able to enjoy the skill and the athleticism and stuff of this generation of players, to be able to be able to position Test match cricket and T20 cricket and 50 over cricket in their roles in the grand scheme of things for getting people to love the sport. And you can't do that if you're playing, or I don't think you can, or I wouldn't have been able to, put it that way. I can only speak for myself. But as a broadcaster, you can do all of those things, and you can cheerlead as well. I mean, but you're cheerleading for the sport. You're not cheerleading for a team. You're cheerleading for the game itself, and you know how great it is, and how enjoyable it can be, and how much of a wonderful thing it is to be involved in at any level, whether you're playing, whether you're a supporter, a volunteer, whatever that might be. You know, it's given me an incredible life, and to be able to say to other people that it can do the same for you if you're open enough to it, that is a great gift, I think.
Yeah, and this stood out to me last year when coming on your debate program, that your interest, intricate interest, if you like, in the nuts and bolts of the workings of the game behind the scene, and the strength of the administration and so on, that's not something you'd necessarily get from a broadcaster who, and this is kind of that this cliche we almost referred to earlier, isn't it? The former player who talks about how they would have done it had they been playing then, and doesn't have a broader frame of reference. But the very fact that you're called upon to host that debate show and to talk about the game far more broadly, it reflects your interest in the health of it, as you say, not just being emotionally wrapped up in wins and losses.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, without that sort of broader remit, I wouldn't enjoy it so much anyway. You know, I tend to sort of like try and stick my nose into all parts. Perhaps not be as informed about everything as you possibly can, but trying to know what's going on. You know, having a broad outlook in the game itself. And again, try to bring people into it. The sport needs that. The sport doesn't need people carping and bitching and saying how much better they would have done it 30 years ago.
Yeah.
No sport needs that. No sport has that, I think, to the extent perhaps that cricket does at times. And so, you know, the job is to look forward a little bit, to be impressed by and to marvel at what these guys can do now that they couldn't do before. I mean, I think that's a far more interesting frame of reference than talking about what they can't do now, as opposed to what they could do before. I mean, who cares? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Mate, I have an incredible amount of respect for the sort of the history of the game and the feats and the numbers of the players gone by. Don't get me wrong. I know all that. I used to know all that as a kid. I used to spend hours with bloody scorebooks and things and looking through. I was a complete nuffy. That got wiped out pretty quick. Don't know what that was. Probably being drinking age. I don't know. But anyway, I did all that stuff. So I have an incredible amount of respect for the guys who have gone before. But they've gone, as I did, and as the next lot will. The game continues, doesn't it?
Yeah. The world doesn't stop. It's interesting that, you know, you've always been pretty politically engaged and not shy about having an opinion politically, whereas like a lot of people in sports broadcasting tend to just stay on the fence because they don't want to say the wrong thing and alienate any part of their audience or whatever it might be. But then, so you already had that had been part of your makeup for a while, and then last year.
I don't know if it had. You know, I don't know if it had. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, okay.
I don't think probably prior to 2016, I don't think I'd ever really kind of been. Well, I certainly wasn't out in terms of sort of any political leaning, and I don't think I was ever really that bothered. But I kind of. It's a little bit like, you know, you spy on injustice. It doesn't matter who you're working for, or whether or not it might impact you negatively down the line. You just say what you think is happening. That's all. Yeah. And I would absolutely I would shrivel at the idea that I was ever sort of politically engaged before, because I wasn't. I just didn't care. I was like most other sports people, no interest whatsoever. You might look at your tax. At your tax bill at the end of the year, and that might be the sum total of your interest in terms of who politically was making those calls. But something, you know, a lot of things have happened in the last 4 or 5 years, and whereby you just think, well, how the hell can you possibly sit on the fence with things like the things we've been witnessing in the last 4 or 5 years? And that's, you know, sometimes I think to myself, for God's sake, just leave it alone. But hopefully I'll leave it. Maybe we should all leave it alone when things are less crappy.
Seems reasonable.
That'd be nice.
That's probably what I'm thinking about. Really, is since 2016. The last 5 years or so. I'm thinking about your online presence more than anything, and so
okay.
that's probably the starting point.
Sure.
But it was notable last year that when the Black Lives Matter movement started becoming more of a thing in Britain and more of a thing in cricket, that you had a prominent place a prominent part to play in that. Your mother was Jamaican, and that didn't necessarily feel like it had been a huge part of your story publicly before, but you were happy to step into that, into the arena once people needed to talk about that, or once the pressure was on to talk about it.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, again, it's kind of like, well, I could sort of just allow, my life's pretty good. I haven't really been adversely affected by the fact that I'm mixed race. My mum is an incredible human. Being sort of a black Jamaican married to a white English boy back in the 70s was not straightforward. But she and my dad always kind of sort of were able to kind of take care of us from, shield us from the worst of that when we were growing up. And so, my experience is genuinely a positive one. I'm incredibly proud of my Jamaican heritage, and it hasn't really caused me any problems. But I know that is not the case for many other people. And so if because I'm able to sort of either articulate, or just because I have the platform from time to time of being on the TV, and I'm asked about it, then I won't shy away from it. I don't think one of the things that I find extraordinary actually is that people find it so difficult to kind of put themselves into other people's experiences, and think that just because I haven't had this thing happen to me, or just because I've never seen it, that it doesn't exist. And it's bizarre. It seems incredible to me that people can have that point of view whereby if I haven't seen it, it hasn't happened type thing. Or if I didn't know what I was looking for, it hasn't happened. It doesn't kind of, and so I think it's important to kind of to be able to listen to people's experiences, and perhaps put two and two together. You're not always going to be presented with the fait accompli. Oh, here it is. I'm like, oh, I can see it now. A certain amount of reading between the lines is necessary every once in a while.
Yeah, sort of almost like acknowledging your privileged, dare I use that loaded term, position in society, having been a former professional athlete and having that platform, that you're perhaps less likely to experience the worst of it. And I think that was a theme of a lot of cricketers last year when the Black Lives Matter conversation was at its peak, if you like, and certainly the vodcast which you're involved in hosting that Sky Cricket put out, and I would call it activism that Sky Cricket did in a really positive way around that first Test match at the EGS Bowl. I mean, it was you could have shouldered arms to that had you seen fit to do so, but there weren't many people shouldering arms. So I think most people were able to acknowledge that, yes, whilst they might sit in a slightly more privileged position, they weren't able to let this one go by.
Yeah, and I think the whole production was and should be very proud of what they did that day, and subsequently as well. It's one of those things that people kind of you can sense fatigue with people on these things, but I think it's incredibly important that we don't. I'm old enough to remember Rodney King and the riots in Los Angeles in the 90s and stuff, and the kind of there was a reaction then, but it disappears. And it happens again, and there's a reaction, and it disappears. The finals, the last straw for me, perhaps on all of that was a guy got killed in broad daylight with witnesses all over the place. Now, if you're telling me that there isn't some kind of idea that I can behave with impunity with this human being because he's black and I'm white, then you're blind. the fact that they felt that they were able to snuff this guy out in full view of everybody, in broad daylight, being videoed, etc., knowing that they were probably going to get away with it, is as big a banner as you can ever have. And so therefore, lots of people were unbelievably shocked, unbelievably sort of outraged, and quite right too. And if it's made various people uncomfortable, then so be it. It's not as uncomfortable as being strangled to death in broad daylight. So you just have to put up with it.
And that what this is showing you isn't like this was some new outrage. It's the impunity that security forces and police forces have in just about every country. That's the way they're set up. There is no accountability. That's part of the deal for the way those forces work.
Yeah, but and again, it's less about the sort of like the police. It's just about the complete and utter disregard for the right of that person to be treated normally. People get apprehended every single day. Not like that, they don't. Not so that it ends with them dying on the street in broad daylight in front of God knows how many witnesses and all of his mates. This wasn't some one-on-one down an alleyway. That's I don't know. I just think you have to stop and think about that for a little while and think what that means, what that's telling you. I went on one of the sort of, it wasn't a march really. We sort of sat in a park, my hometown, and listened to some incredibly eloquent and incredibly bright, young, Black, Asian people from my hometown. Peaceful, everybody socially distanced, everybody wearing masks, and it was great. It was I'd never done anything like that before, and I'm really proud that I did, or pleased that I did, not proud. And the younger generation seem to be completely all over all of this sort of stuff, and have realised or understood or just can't understand why things wouldn't be different from the way they are now. And so, who knows, 15 years time, 20 years time, we might have to talk about this less or not at all.
Yeah, let's hope so. And I suppose between times you don't just have the microphone as a commentator and your social media platforms to talk. You've also got your art and your music, and you're still creating. You've still got that inspiration that's fueling you making a lot of music.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think we're about a month or so away from releasing another four tracks on an EP with a view of putting out an album in October, November. So yeah, the writing is good. I mean, that's one of the incredible things about this, about being in lockdown and all the other kind of stuff. That there's not much else to do but sort of be creative. Obviously, look after the little ones and whatever. And when you get 5 minutes, disappear off to the shed and go and write. Read, write. It's all good.
We might let you get back to doing just that. Nice place to leave it. Mark Butcher, you've been just a fantastic guest. Thanks for sharing so many of your experiences in a remarkable life in cricket, and may they continue for many decades to come.
Cheers, gents. Thank you. Thanks very much.
It's the final word. Adam Collins and Geoff Lemon. Thanks again to Mark Butcher for being so wonderfully generous with his time this morning. Just one of the most sound people in cricket, Geoff, whether that's his judgment on air or the way that he articulates himself or the way that he's transitioned from being a fine batsman. I mean, I think in some respects there we fell into the trap of almost underplaying what a fine player he was. But now, arguably, an even finer broadcaster, one we're going to see for many years on our screens.
I also liked your use of the word sound then as an adjective, which there was a real sort of British trend of that for a while. Do they still do that? Do people still say, "Oh yeah, sound, mate, sound"?
I must admit, it might be the case. I've lived here too long that I started using their words. I got pulled up on this last week for, I think Mezzy Jez, one of our patrons. I used telly in the OBO, and he wrote back saying, that means you're officially English now, not saying TV, you're saying telly. I never...
it doesn't?
I never thought of it that way.
It doesn't? You use telly in Australia.
You
We've
do?
said telly
I
for
thought
years.
so. I thought
we
so
put
as
wires
well.
on the end of things. What's on the telly? Yeah, chuck on the telly, mate. Come on, that's fucking Australian as.
All right.
So that was a bit New Zealand. But sound, you'd be like, oh, you want a pint? You go, sound, mate, sound. Yeah.
I'll take it on notice. I'll find out. You tell me. Am I sounding too English at the moment? Probably not with this Southeast Melbourne
I don't think it's current.
accent.
I reckon it was a previous British thing. I reckon it's like a 20 years ago sort of British word, Ask Felix White.
Noted.
He'd know.
Okay, to finish, Jeff, we have some housekeeping in the form of the Bannerman updates. This is where we ask our listeners, if you're new to the show, if you've heard the Butch interview and you're sticking with us, you're with us for the first time, to identify innings where a team's been all out, but there's been a player in the team make in excess of 67.35% of the runs, which was the percentage of Charles Bannerman in the first Test innings played back at the MCG in 1877. And we had one in, Jeff, from our producer, Dave Collins, DC, who wrote us during the week to tell us about a double century at his old club.
Yeah, well, this was one that he remembered from many moons ago. For whatever reason, it stayed in his mind, which I suppose it would stay in your mind. And this is in a 2 innings match, batting second. So Mornington have made 319, and then chasing in an all out effort, chasing that I don't want to give this away, but you have to at this point. It falls just short. This is P. Bradley. I don't know the first name of P. Bradley, but I'm just going off the scorecards here. Who made an even 200 runs. The next best score was 29. The next best score after that was 16. There were half a dozen scores in double figures. And P. Bradley was, I reckon, the second last player to get out. And they ended up making 310. So they fell 10 runs short of the chase, with one player having made 200 out of 310, which is, I think, just shy of Bannerman. I reckon that's about 65%. But it's worthy of a mention in that this was in the second innings after P. Bradley had bowled 36 overs in the first innings and taken 4 wickets. No one else bowled more than 12. So presumably a spinner came on and twirled through 36 overs while they made 7 for 319 and then came out and peeled off an even 200 runs in the chase that fell short. Losing that game, you would feel a little justified in being shitty at your teammates that no one else did anything.
Yeah, P. Bradley's definitely carried the team on his back. DC, let us know what his first name is. And the second one here is from Dan O'Connell, not the Dan O'Connell pub cricket team that you played for with distinction, Jeff, but our patron, Daniel O'Connell, who let us know that on the weekend, Lockie Wade from St Berners Cricket Club scored 84 out of their third 11's 118. An innings that included 2 sixes and his highest score in a career that spanned over 100 matches. It's also worth noting that he batted at number 10 the week before. So a real up yours to the skipper when he peeled off 80-odd. Unfortunately, though, there was a twist. Dan wrote us a subsequent email after looking at the card in greater depth to realise they only lost 9 wickets. The number 11 stuck around for 3 balls to get some red ink alongside Lockie Wade, who also was unbeaten on 84. So that means that despite being 71.2% a contender, a qualifier, it doesn't meet the bill because it wasn't all out. So well played, Lockie. More of it, but and thanks to Dan for bringing it to our attention and correcting the record. That was good of him, but not quite there. So the key point here is if you have Bannermans, and I'll tell you what, we've got an absolute beauty coming up on Storytime this week from Thomas Melia, who is perhaps my favourite Bannerman ever, dare I say, apart from the original Charles himself, will be with us. I'll reveal all on Saturday when we return for Storytime. So between times, get your nominations in from club cricket, park cricket, community cricket, whatever it is. We want to know any batter 67.35% or better. We need to know about them on the final word, Jeff.
Yeah, that 71%. Good effort. We will do all of that and more on the weekend show on the Storytime. Other than that, we have our weekly show, which is like this one, where we talk about cricket or interview people and do things of that nature, which usually comes out on a Wednesday. Sometimes it moves around a bit, but, you don't want to be too predictable in these times. So if you're new to the show and you've listened all the way to the end, well done. And if you'd like to continue listening to it, that's when it will be out. Sometimes there are daily shows during tournaments and series when we're able to do those as well. If you want to support the show, patreon.com/thefinalword. The spelling of patron is Patreon. Who knows why? We don't. And aside from that, I will leave the rest of it to you.
Yes, thanks to Seabar Super, seabarsuper.com.au/the final word. If you want to learn more about sorting your super out, go and pay them a visit. Thank you to Wisden Cricket Monthly for being fine supporters of us as well. And last but not least, to Mark Butcher, again, outstanding guest. We really hope you enjoyed that interview. There'll be more of those throughout the course of 2021, and there'll be so much more final word. Thank you to everyone watching on YouTube. I'm waving to you now. Jump on the page and subscribe there. We'll have those T20 videos coming up later in the week when India hosts England. That's enough from us. This show is produced on the Bad Producer podcast label. Thank you to Dave Collins for editing us, and we'll talk to you all again on the weekend. Bye for now.